Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hardcore Finance Show with Alex and Shimon. Today, we're joined by our former guest and then guest again, Dritan Nesho, who runs a lot of market research companies and has been in market research his whole life. He was also the most accurate pollster of the last election cycle. And what we wanted to pick Dritan's brain about today is infrastructure. We know the big Biden infrastructure plan is coming. We know that we're going to spend a lot of trillion. The amounts are differing and varying, but it's going to be pretty big. And we also know that, Democrats are pushing for tax increases in order to pay for this plan. So we always talked about money printing. This will actually curb money printing theoretically and increase taxes. But let's really analyze what it is, who wants it, and where do we go from here? So Shimon, how are you? Dritan, how are you?
Hey guys, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we're excited to have Dritan on the show. He's one of the most popular guests we've had.
And you're my favorite podcast.
That's right. Well, there's lots of love to go around, that's for sure. So why don't we just jump in? Can you give us just a quick overview, for those who don't know, what are we talking about here? We hear infrastructure, how much, where is it going? What are we actually building? Is it roads and bridges? Is it childcare? I heard AOC talk a lot about how, infrastructure means a lot of different things. So what does it actually mean?
Sure. So this is the next big initiative as part of Biden's first 100 days. But I would very much expect that the fight over infrastructure reform and what's called the American Jobs Plan to follow the American Recovery Act, which was the COVID Relief Act and Biden's first hallmark piece of legislation after he took office, I think the fight over infrastructure will actually drag on. And there's many reasons why that is. Shimon alluded to some of them. I mean, there's been a lot of deficit spending over the last year to help mitigate the effects of the pandemic. The latest round was $1.9 trillion, which was in January, the American Recovery Act that Biden passed. And in sum, between the amount of money spent by Trump over 3 rounds of relief and Biden over 1 round of relief, it's coming close to $5 trillion. That's a lot of deficit spending. That's a lot of money being printed and being injected into the economy. Certainly necessary because of the drop in GDP of over 30% and the temporary slowdown because of COVID. But there's a very clear rule in economics. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And there will be a day of reckoning where somehow, some way, the U.S. government will have to pay for this spending. So if we look at what has been spent already, the markets are already a little bit jittery about the amount of money that's being printed, and voters are starting to catch up to that as well. And so enter now the American Jobs Act, or the Infrastructure Investment Plan, Biden's Infrastructure Investment Plan, which is scoped out at about $2 trillion. And the way that the administration has stated it plans to pay for it is, frankly, through tax increases, by raising the corporate tax rate from the 21% that it is currently under the Trump tax plan to 28. And it would roughly fall somewhere in between the 35% that it was during Obama's time, that many businesses deemed to make their corporations or their companies non-competitive, and the 21% under Trump, which the markets and businesses really, really loved. And then also the second part of how the Biden administration is planning to pay for this $2 trillion package over the course of 10 to 15 years is by raising taxes on high income earners. And then there's also been some other ideas floated around, such as potentially introducing a gasoline tax. And taxes are very much part and parcel of what happens with infrastructure, and that always sets up a large political fight within Congress and certainly in the eyes of voters. So, $2 trillion infrastructure plan. It's the follow-up to the $1.9 trillion that Biden led with in terms of COVID relief. The implications are more deficit spending, more printing, and possibly more taxes. And so that sets up a pretty big fight ahead of any potential vote.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting point. I think that just to frame things, I don't think it really matters where the money comes from. Like, there's a lot of political debate, like, do we do corporate taxes? Do we do income taxes? Do we do like debt or print money? And yeah, it on the margin affects a bit of different groups. Like, for example, if you do income tax, not everybody pays income tax, or corporate tax for the rich people. But at the end of the day, this boils down to like, is this a good investment? In which case, great, let's do it. Like, if we can invest money and get more money over the long run from it, like fixing a bridge, fixing a tunnel, building more bridges, doing something on infrastructure that, broadband internet, all of those are good investments. The problem is that currently under the fiat standard, where the government can just print as much money as they want, we have no mechanism to guarantee that it is a good investment. And there's no check and balance until many, many years pass, because only then was it a good idea? For example, the interstate highway project was a very, very good investment in retrospect. Many people have analyzed it. Going to the moon before we had like a computer, maybe not so good. Maybe we should have waited for 20 years.
What about Bitcoin going to the moon? Is that good investment or bad investment?
Bitcoin going to the moon. So Dritan, my question to you is like, I was very surprised in our pre-conversation that people are actually pretty smart about that stuff. So could you tell us, how do people perceive this investment? Like, do you think it's good? Do they think it's good or bad? And what is the sentiment around that issue?
Sure. So I'm going to wear both of my favorite hats here. And so I'll answer your question, Shimon, whether or not this is a good investment as an economist, first and foremost. And then I'll answer your question whether this is a good investment as someone who loves studying the wisdom of the crowd, as a market researcher, and as a public policy pollster. From an economic perspective, if you look at how the $2 trillion is being conceived of being spent, right, about $121 billion of that is in so-called infrastructure and transportation infrastructure, right? So fundamentally, roads, railways, bridges, and also a focus on clean energy.
So that's 10%? You're saying that's 10% of the total?
No, so that's actually 30% of the total, right? More or less.
Oh.
And then another 30% of the $2 trillion, 650 billion, is in what's being called quality of life at home. But primarily, this is an investment in utilities, clean water, the electric grid, again, a significant amount going into clean energy. Then it starts getting a lot more murky after this first, $900 billion that has been earmarked on more or less conventional infrastructure projects, plus an investment in clean energy that looks at not only the electric grid and improving the electric grid and the energy sources into the electric grid, but also includes, for example, a $174 billion investment to accelerate the electric vehicles market, which, at least in my perspective, it's a very worthwhile investment. And very much electric vehicles are the transportation mode of the future, not the combustion engine. Where it gets a lot more murky, though, is the next $1 trillion of spending. So $400 billion are being earmarked as help for caregivers and are being earmarked as going to the caregiving economy. What that means is that this is money to fundamentally support an aging population and elderly Americans, and also other types of caregiving support. And so from a pure economic perspective, I don't quite see the augmented effect on growth coming from this $400 billion, right? There's an immediate effect in the lifestyle of Americans and improving the lifestyle of Americans. And I don't want to downplay that in any way, shape, or form. But if you focus on purely the solo growth model and what we know about the rules of modern economics, that if you're going to spend a bunch of money, especially through deficit spending or pressures like new taxes, which are more contractionary in their nature, then you need to make sure that your investment will generate a growth rate, an economic growth rate, which usually comes through some kind of augmented labor, augmented technology, augmented infusion into the economy that will overtake those pressures, whether the pressures of taxes or the pressures of inflation and deficit spending. And so 400 billion is a very large amount to go into the care economy. Then another $480 billion is going into manufacturing and research and development. Now, one part of that equation, the research and development part of the equation, is very important. And if we want to remain competitive vis-a-vis emerging economies like China, who are also non-democratic economies and countries, then R&D is a very important place to dump $480 billion. However, manufacturing, as we know, and as many economists will tell you, is not where the US economy needs to focus. The jobs of the future are not necessarily in manufacturing. The output of the future is more in services and in technology and the scale that they are providing than it is in manufacturing. And so, again, there's a lot of room for spending that doesn't yield that economic return that you very accurately called out as being very important to spending of this scale. And so this is why 80% of voters, and kind of putting on my other hat of the wisdom of the crowd, 80% of voters already are concerned about potential misspending and pork as part of this infrastructure bill. And so you have a very, very popular initiative, infrastructure reform, infrastructure spending, that for the 4 years of the Trump administration registered 60, 70, 80% support in terms of voters across all party affiliation wanting it to be pushed through, that it's still wildly popular, but now the enthusiasm is being tempered by some concerns about whether or not this investment will really pan out. And again, the statistics from the polling that are fascinating are 80% are concerned about misspending or pork. When you ask voters whether the gains from a new infrastructure bill will outweigh the costs, even if those costs are in the trillions of dollars, 47% say yes, and 53% say no. So again, a very split mind on the infrastructure investment as it is now, or as it's being presented now. And then also when you ask voters whether passing a new infrastructure bill will improve people's lives and lead to faster economic growth, so we should not really worry about how much money is being spent or not have sticker shock, or whether passing a new infrastructure bill will trigger rising prices for goods and services, i.e. inflation, and a fiscal crisis for the country. Again, it's a pretty split view, and one angling on the side of caution. 46% say it will improve people's lives, so we shouldn't worry. 54% say, no, we're concerned about inflation and a real fiscal crisis.
How does that split by party? I mean, 46, 54. I'm assuming many Republicans are in that, 54. Are there Democrats that are in that, cautionary window? Is there a normal amount of Democrats that are saying, hey, wait a second, this might not be what we need right now?
Sure. So yes, there are Democrats that are in that cautionary group. And I can give you the exact statistics. So, for example, 26% of Democrats are very concerned that there's wasteful spending as part of a new infrastructure bill, and 43% said that they are somewhat concerned. Taken together, that's close to 70% of Democrats showing some level of concern about wasteful spending, and very much in line with Republicans, which of course it's higher, and independents, which are more or less in line with this. And then on the questions that I just cited to you, whether the investment would be worthwhile or not, I'll give you the splits in just a second. There's a lot of numbers to remember off the top of my head.
Well, that's okay. While you're pulling this up, I just want to say maybe one
Sure.
thing. There's and you should tell us the numbers, but there's probably an uber point here that we should discuss. Like, should the government even have a say? And where is that boundary of, what's a good investment and what's a bad investment, right? Maybe this is to Shimon's point. I want to hear the Republican numbers. I think it will be critical, but we're saying the government is now allocating a lot of this money and saying, well, okay, so the caregivers allocation and then the EV allocation. Now, I'm also for EVs. Frankly, I own Tesla stock, so I would love for money to go there from a personal benefit perspective. But if I'm honest with myself and I take off my Tesla hat, my personal investment hat, and again, I also believe in EVs, but is it the government's place? And by the way, the government has helped traditional energy companies, oil companies with tax breaks and incentives for decades. And then started helping a little bit of renewables. There was a big push against renewables. But in general, should the government even subsidize some of this, maybe early exploration, but ongoing, should they subsidize an industry just to subsidize an industry, pick winners and losers? I don't know. I think Shimon and I are both on the fence of they shouldn't. They should aid and assist and provide guardrails so the markets are fair, but they shouldn't necessarily pick winners and losers, because this is just going on a bad road.
Yeah, and also another interesting thing to know about specifically electric vehicles, because I heard a podcast, if you account for the carbon emissions that are manufacturing the vehicle, so like basically you have to manufacture the batteries, which is like a super intensive process, right? And then you have to do a lot of stuff. If you account for that, the difference between a car that emits, in an electric car, which also it matters, like where does the electricity come from, right? It's not like we're all running on nuclear power plants. So this electricity also emits. So like some people make the case that electric vehicles just shift where the emissions happen, but and it's definitely lower emissions. The question is like, could we take this money and instead of subsidizing electric vehicles, do something that lowers emissions even more? And that's a complicated question, especially when the government has no incentive to really spend money efficiently. Like when we were on the gold standard, we had an incentive, like if you would make many bad decisions, you would go bankrupt. But now there's no way for you to go bankrupt. You just keep printing money and then the poor people pay the price of inflation. So that's pretty concerning.
Yeah, I mean, to both of your points, right? What do we know about this 400 billion that is going to caregivers for the elderly and the disabled, right? Which is wonderful, right? But should not really be part of an infrastructure investment bill, right? We know that it's meant to improve access to quality, affordable homes or community-based care for the elderly and people with disabilities. We know that it would expand the Medicaid program to make more services available and eliminate a backlog that prevents thousands from getting care. We know that it would boost pay for care workers who are disproportionately women of color and typically earn about $12 an hour. And I'm reading this almost verbatim from the announcement of the infrastructure plan. And these don't sound like the normal type of things that you would think are part of an infrastructure investment plan. And, in the similar token, when you look at the manufacturing and R&D spend, which is about $450 billion, again, a fairly significant line item, it's a very mixed bag, right? I mean, $52 billion of that $450 billion would go to domestic manufacturing, supporting rural manufacturing and clean energy. Okay, possibly gray area. 48 billion would go to American workforce development and worker protection. Again, there's a question of whether or not this falls within an infrastructure spending bill. 40 billion would go in upgrading research infrastructure and laboratories. That's definitely part of the modern infrastructure of the country. 35 billion would go to technology that addresses the climate crisis. Again, you could make an argument that this is part of an infrastructure investment bill, but then again, if you ask voters, should climate change related provisions be part of an infrastructure bill, the majority say no. And when you ask them, should wealth inequality related provisions be part of an infrastructure related bill, again, a majority say no. For the first is a 56% majority that says infrastructure and climate change are not related and should be dealt with at different times. And for the wealth inequality, it's 64% who say that wealth inequality is separate from infrastructure, and again, should be dealt at a separate time.
Can I just say one?
Yeah, I can keep going, but it's a very mixed bag, right? You have $1 trillion that basically falls under a question mark of sorts, whether it belongs in a bill like this.
Yeah, well, I think what's really sad to me as an aside is, when did we get away with it? It's just unfortunate that we got away with, instead of taking these things kind of standalone and on their own merits. And like you said, is helping women of color who are disproportionately affected, right? Is it bad or good? It's good. But why does it have to be thrown into a separate thing called infrastructure and pushed down? And I get this is the only way of getting things across, but it's just so sad that the system fragmented itself to such a position where we can't, the people aren't necessarily, the wisdom of the crowds. There's something to be said for the wisdom of the crowds, right? And what we're seeing from the data is that the people are wary. It's not just spend. And maybe we've gotten to a point where now, because of coronavirus, because of all the spending, the average American can now see that, oh my God, spending isn't good. That going out and, consumables aren't rising, but all the investable assets are rising. And people are feeling that, for any new family looking, and this is all over the US, buying a house, house prices went up by 20%. If people feel that now they can't afford, what they could afford before, even a year ago. And I think this is very, in the long run, we talk a lot about, and I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, but I think this is super important. It's super important for me. And this is where, when I look back at my career, I was wrong. And I'll tell you what I was wrong about. I remember starting off my career, I was fairly young, 2007, 2008, the Great Recession happened. And I was praying for the bank bailout. And in retrospect, that was probably wrong. We should have felt, it's like pulling a Band-Aid. We let the system be so leveraged, and it was so poorly run. There was going to be a lot of pain. Don't get me wrong, a lot of pain. But what we've done, we drugged the shit out of the system, just shot a whole bunch of adrenaline into it. And now we're the whole economy is addicted to the stimulus. And so we're just prolonging the pain. And then at some point it's going to be bad, right? And so I think people, because of the coronavirus, are now really feeling the effects of, hey, we haven't gone through a cleanse. A system needs to go through a cleanse. There are natural up and down cycles. And so because we can't go through this cleanse, I think people in the middle class and the lower classes are really starting to look and say, holy shit, yeah, I have more money, but I can't afford the things I could afford in terms of actual life-changing things. Moving, getting a new job, getting a house. These things are becoming much more expensive. And so I think people are starting to feel it. And maybe this is the time to kind of reset and say, let's take things as they stand, right? Do we want to do this program? Infrastructure, yes or no? Do we want to do this program? Yes or no? All these programs are good. Many programs are good, but we can't spend infinitely. We have to, as a nation, and every nation, make concrete, discrete choices, A or B. And like you said, Shimon, when we were on the gold standard, you only had X amount of gold. So you could literally only do A or B. And if you made the wrong decision, you went bankrupt. That was a very real a very real, effect. And maybe the government, like I have nothing against the government having 5-10%, whatever it is, as think of it like a VC fund. Everyone comes to it, pitches for grants, and you give out these grants, right, to different companies, and then you judge them or different initiatives based on the ROI. Some are maybe geopolitical, right? Some are maybe humanitarian. But this constant giving and giving and giving to just everything and everywhere and porking everything up, we're going to hit a wall that's going to be so hard. I mean, it's going to come. We cannot keep on doing this. We just can't.
Yeah, and I'll just add a small thing, which is like, it's not even about the amount that we spend. It's like, what do we spend it on? So like we could spend on something, or instead we could spend on education. Like education is not less important than clean energy, in my opinion, right? Like both are important. So it's like, it's not like, do we oppose spending or are we pro spending? It's like, what is the most efficient way to use this money? And I've seen zero debate on this. Zero. Like you support the bill or you're against the bill, and nobody has the nuance of like, wait, do we want to spend money on like caregivers?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Spend it on education or for like low-income kids. Instead.
But you and I talk about this a lot, right, Shimon? So let's take education or any sector. If you focus money into a certain sector, you automatically inflate that sector, right? And so there's a beautiful thing, by the way, that a great way to think about taxing. So I know we're kind of coming back to this infrastructure plan, but we funded the stimulus by printing money. We issued bonds, then we went on and bought those bonds. Essentially, we're just printing money. We're buying our own debt with printed money from the Treasury. The other way is to increase taxes. And Elizabeth Warren and some of the left are coming out and saying, increase the wealth, tax the wealth of the rich, not income, but wealth. And again, what kind of kills me is that there are people don't think through second and third order in they don't think 2 levels down from what they're trying to do. So let's talk about taxes for a second. And this is very similar to concentrating money in a certain sector. When you concentrate money in a certain sector, you inflate that sector. Education is perfect. The reason why we have such huge education is we flooded the market with student loans. These are the huge costs of education are coming from student loans from the 70s. And you and I, she want to talk about this all the time in other podcasts. If we start taxing the wealthy, we will do a similar thing to the whole economy. What is the point of taxing income versus wealth? When you tax income, you reduce spending because you're basically you're taxing the amount people can take home and then spend. So you're literally reducing the demand. For competing services, the government also has to go out and buy. Government goes out and buys services, whether it's people, goods, or services. When you tax income, you slow down the velocity and you slow down the competition for that same pool of services, thus decreasing the cost for the government. When you tax wealth, you don't take that haircut out of the system. So the goods, the cost of your own services that the government has to go out and get is going to increase. And then it enters a vicious cycle. It inflates costs in the whole system. And this is why, again, it kills me that no one doesn't teach people this, and no one actually analyzes these ways of paying for different initiatives, or whether these initiatives, where they're going. And it's just sad, because what we're doing in the name of helping the poor, we're impoverishing the poor in the long run. The poor are getting worse and worse off relative to where they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that's just a sad fact. That's just a sad fact. Anyway, I went a little bit of a diatribe, but this stuff just kills me, because there are a lot of good things in the infrastructure plan, I think, and we can't decouple the good from the bad. And there is, like you said, Shimon, no mechanism from decoupling the two.
Well, you'll be very happy to know, Alex, that there's very little appetite for raising taxes. 69% of voters oppose raising taxes at the federal level. 73% oppose raising income taxes. And there's more appetite on a wealth tax along the lines of an annual tax levied on the value of a person's houses, stocks, cash, and businesses. but still 56% are against it. And you don't get this kind of numbers if you don't have the majority of independents basically being against taxes, which is a key swing group that you need politically, but even strong percentages of Democrats, right? About a third of Democrats, going back to your earlier questions, are concerned on whether or not the return on this investment is there and whether or not this infrastructure bill will improve their lives. That's a pretty large number of Democrats to basically put a question mark on this bill. And in a similar fashion, while Democrats are more in favor of a wealth tax, again, there's a clear lack of appetite for any other kind of taxes. There's more appetite on corporate taxes, sure, increasing corporate taxes, and especially making sure that profits that are accrued abroad by US corporations are properly taxed when they're brought back into the country, which is its own debate, whether there's double taxing or not, and whether or not that should happen. But when it comes to taxes on an individual level or on the level of voters and Americans, the appetite isn't there. So that's one point to be made. The other point that needs to be made is that because of all of the implications that we've been speaking about, taxes, deficit spending, the specter of inflation, the fact that the economy or the US government might be overextended in its spending and its debt, and the economy might overheat. These are all very, very serious factors that could cause a lot more hurt, which comes from good intention. Because of this, now you have a phenomenon where 56% of voters say that, look, Democrats want to go back to big tax and spend welfare state. And it's kind of giving Democrats a label that turns away and turns off from these kinds of good initiatives, largely very positive initiatives, the key swing groups and the key independents that you need to attract. And this is why, in my perception, this kind of issue sandwich, right, where you take a very big bill, you have a lot that people like and support, but you throw in a bunch of stuff there that people don't like. So I don't want lettuce in my sandwich, but there's a heck of a lot of cabbage and lettuce and pork in this one. Then, people start waning in their support of such a popular initiative, infrastructure spending and infrastructure reform, and it sets up for a protracted fight, because all of the sudden now a majority of Americans, including a very, very good amount of Democrats, actually want a bipartisan bill. They're concerned about these elements, so they're saying, look, you got to get the other guy to go along with you, otherwise we're not so sure that we want to support it. And so this is why I led off the presentation by saying that the ability to pass an infrastructure reform bill, an infrastructure spending bill, might actually get bogged down into a protracted political fight. And who knows, maybe it kills the bill, and that would just be too bad. Because during the 4 years of the Trump administration, no one wanted to come together on infrastructure because it didn't give them a political edge. Everyone supported it, therefore parties couldn't really differentiate on it. Now we're in a position when people still support it. It's another point where parties can come together, but because of many social initiatives that have been rolled, social and welfare initiatives that have been rolled in this infrastructure investment plan, it actually risks the overall investment. And I think personally that there's a lot of good spending in this bill, and the return of invested capital is there for most of the bill, right? For 60 or 70% of what's being earmarked in the bill. The other 30%, that's why we're here today. That's why we're
hit on grannies
discussion.
You raise a really good point though about like Trump. So if I wish we weren't so partisan, and I know it's like kind of a wish land for me, and that's why I love Bitcoin, because it just allows me to opt out of the whole process. But I'm just thinking, Trump spoke about infrastructure. 2019 was a phenomenal year economically. And then the Democrats, if they just cared about these projects, they would totally have supported him and this bill could have passed. But now it's easy for Republicans to say, no, we're not going to support this because it's wrong, right? So we, in a sense, missed a chance to spend a lot more. And it was the same with like the COVID stuff that like Nancy Pelosi kind of blocked Trump's idea. And then she had a very similar idea like later. And so the same amount of money could have reached people sooner. I just wish that people would somehow have a mechanism. And again, back to my point of like sound money or some kind of check and balance would remove at least a little bit of this, because people would say, okay, it's a good idea, let's do it now, and then we'll reap the benefits in 2 years, and then we can spend on our things.
But many pundits were saying, and I agree with this, that Trump's initial thing should have been infrastructure. He came in and he was stuck on a bunch of different stuff. Tax cuts, I mean, I don't know what probably because he had to, he had his folks that he needed to take care of. But I think he came in, it was so polarizing, right? And had the first thing been infrastructure, it would have been real hard for Democrats to have been opposed that when everyone was supportive of that. And I think it was a colossal strategic mistake for Trump not to push infrastructure in his first 100 days. He went with tax cuts, right? Well, actually, it was repeal Obamacare, then tax cuts. It was just like this FU to the Democrats just because he could. And it was his personality. And ultimately, his personality is the downfall of Trump, right? But like it's the up and down of Trump. But had he done infrastructure, who would have had the political will to say no to that? Would we all know that the bridges are crumbling, roads are in shit shape, we're like a third world country? That's a fact in terms of what we are from an infrastructure perspective. Why didn't he do that? It would have been a huge stimulus to the economy.
So guys, as we kind of come slowly to a close, I would really love to hear Dritan's opinion. And then Alex and I can also give our opinion. 2 questions. 1, will the bill pass, yes or no? In whichever, and if it passes, like what specifically will pass? And 2, what would be the impact on the economy and on the stock market?
Sure. So my perspective is that the longer the clock ticks, the lower the chances of this bill passing, especially as the economy opens back up and people then start growing more and more concerned about inflation and taxes, and they don't feel that they need another boost in the arm, right? Or a booster shot in the arm, pun intended, in the shape of an infrastructure reform bill. And that would just be too bad. Because as Alex mentioned, this is something that should have passed during the Trump years, and we have another opportunity here to bring the country's infrastructure up to competitive standards. I think the United States overall ranks 13th in the world in terms of infrastructure investments. I think China is first, maybe second. And there is a very real component of global competitiveness here on an economic level, on a political level, on a technological level, that this infrastructure investment plays into it. I also think that there's not enough jujitsu that goes on in politics anymore, right? In the good old days, you take the other person's initiative or what their voters want, and you offer your kind of solutions to it. And so there's a fair deal of jujitsu that can happen here by the Biden administration, the Democrats, where they can come in and say, look, we will commit to passing a bipartisan bill as long as you commit to passing a bill, period. And even if it's a watered down version of this $2 trillion infrastructure investment bill, it will actually be a net positive for the country. That's a way of scoring a win and, frankly, taking a win away from the other side, who will be more interested in blocking it in its current format than actually going along with it. So I think that there's a fair bit of triangulation that can happen just in the willingness and in the commitment to pass a bill. There's a fair bit of triangulation or jujitsu that can happen in framing it as an important element of our global competitiveness, especially vis-a-vis China, which reels in a lot of Republican voters and a lot of independent voters. And frankly, it's true. A bill like this is both good politics and good policy. And I do think that there are improvements that can be made by giving the political middle more of a which are topics that Republicans care about, and less about welfare, which are topics that Democrats care about. But
I think we're slowly but surely losing Dritan to infrastructure difficulties that
Yeah,
Ryan.
exactly. Getting into the rusty pipes of the internet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're losing you to
well,
infrastructure.
I don't know where you guys lost me, but I think that if the middle takes more of the driver's seat on this, and it's an investment on the infrastructures of the future, technology and broadband and the jobs of the future, that wouldn't be such a bad thing, right? And so there is a win-win path on infrastructure if only the political sides come together, Republicans and Democrats come together and commit to it.
And what do you think of the second part? What would the effect be on?
Well, I think a clean infrastructure bill would put the U.S. economy on steroids in the good sense of the word, right? I mean, we would be seeing
the bill that would actually pass. So my question was
That's
like,
right.
would it pass it or not? And if the answer is yes, what would be the effect of the bill that passes on the stock market?
Sure. I think a clean infrastructure bill that's between $1 trillion and $1.2 trillion that doesn't include welfare spending could actually make the U.S. The U.S. economy 1 to 2% more GDP growth as it emerges out of the pandemic. And you're already looking at GDP growth of 4 to 6% coming out of the pandemic. So that would be an incredible thing for the country. I mean, lots of positive first and second order effects, which probably are subject of another conversation together.
Awesome. Alex, what do you think?
I won't comment on whether it passes or not, but I will comment on, because I just don't know. But I will say that if it does, our economy will definitely get fat, like PHT balloon. Here's my bet, right? My bet is that it does pass. And what I think is going to happen, I'll give you a little bit of I'll go on a limb, and I'll say that when this happens, there'll be a huge in the market kind of cyclicals of infrastructure, specific companies, traditional infrastructure will start ballooning. People will move into them and start buying up those stocks and investing in those companies. And I actually think that's the wrong trade. That's the wrong trade. And people will find out in a few months that is the wrong trade. I think in the medium to long run, the right trade is, again, tech. And you and I tweeted about this probably a couple of weeks ago. Where's most of the value? Where is it going to go? Let's say we pass this bill. We need to fix our roads. Is it going to go to the cement company or the drone company that's surveying the land and mapping, or the architect, or AutoCAD and other software companies that are helping to actually develop this, right? Is it going to go to your, I don't know, a traditional manufacturing company, or is it going to go to the chip makers to make endpoints across, and sensors to create all the touch points for the IoT? So we're going to see, I think, in chips, in drones, and transportation technology, and a lot of software as a service companies in the medium term, an incredible boost from the spending. It's not going to go to traditional industries anymore. And this will serve, just like, here's my bold prediction, just like the coronavirus served as an elucidation, as an acute example of how printing money is terrible for you. This is what got Michael Saylor into Bitcoin. This is what's getting all these Americans to see that inflation actually is coming. This is what's getting people to feel, oh my God, I cannot buy the house for X amount of dollars because the home prices have just increased, right? In the same way, I think it will get people to really understand the Cathie Wood's perspective of the world, which is very much what you and I have been talking about for a year and a half. You can timestamp everything that we've said on all the podcasts for our listeners. Go back and listen to our podcast from a year and a half ago when we talk about tech is eating the world, okay? all of this is going to come to tech, and people are going to say, we've spent all this infrastructure money, right? But wait a second, it didn't go to these traditional companies that we thought it was going to go to. It's going to come actually to technology that's going to digitally enable all of these changes to happen. And obviously it will be a boost for the telecoms because of 5G. But that's my big bold bet, that the market is going to have a fake out, right? It's going to go to the traditional kind of cyclicals or the traditional infrastructure plays, and then it's going to quickly snap back to tech because it will see after a quarter or two of earnings where the actual value is. And this will be the last foundational kind of stake. It's going to the last stake in the coffin for people to understand that the tech revolution is here and the deadwood is going to be purged. My bold prediction. What about you, Shimon?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, this episode actually left me very optimistic. I wasn't expecting the public to be kind of so aligned with what I think. I always thought that the public is like, yeah, let's spend on everything. And now, look, some people say the U.S. is an empire in decline. I completely reject that, right? But what could happen is that the U.S. government has reached like its peak size, and now it will slowly start shrinking, but like shrinking only in the amount of money that it spends. It doesn't mean that the services that they provide have to shrink, right? Because like if we think about it, we're talking a lot about technological deflation here, how like technology makes everything cheaper. So then why does the government budget always inflate? It kind of doesn't make sense to me, but it definitely feels that we've hit some kind of like wall with all the COVID spending and the infrastructure spending and this and that. And so I think, yeah, we'll just have to start being much smarter as a government, because that's it. Rates are at zero. You can't lower rates anymore. Rates have been going down for like 40 years. And that was a very easy thing for the government to do. That's it. You can't take them lower. Like what you can do is take the real rates lower by like increasing inflation, but that's kind of a dangerous game because once it gets out of control, it's really hard to control it. So I think we've kind of hit the apex of inefficiency. And from here on, if the government wants to keep doing stuff, it will have to just be more and more efficient. And that makes me very optimistic. And I'm also optimistic on the people here, on how smart they are, and how actually I think it's really good that basically, Dritan, what you're saying is like the touch point between Republicans and Democrats are only on the things that both people agree on, which are probably the most kind of efficient thing to spend the money on.
Yeah.
And that's great. That
yeah,
actually
this is definitely an area where you do want to go with the wisdom of the crowd, and actually the crowd is quite wise. And I'll mention something to conclude, and we'll see whether or not it happens. The one element that people or voters loved the most about Trump's infrastructure plan, his $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan, was the fact that it put the private sector in the lead. And half of that was through incentives to the private sector to actually go and make the investments in infrastructure. It's fascinating because people understand the amplifying effect of getting the capital markets to gear up and move in the way that they move, getting the private sector to implement and execute in the efficient way that it knows how to do. And that really plays into the strengths of the country. The US government might be the most efficient government in the world, but it's still significantly less efficient than the private sector. This isn't a matter of opinion. This is something that's been proven by the last 70 years of economic history, and possibly even more. And so I think there's something to be said here about going less the route of a New Deal deficit spending, tax the wealthy approach, and more the route of a self-sustaining permanent investment in the infrastructure and the technologies of the future. And I think that, if they want this bill to go through, which shame on them if they can't come together and negotiate, the political class, the DC elites, then they should listen to the voters. They should come and to the middle and negotiate, and we will all be better off because of that. Democrats, Republicans, and everyone of every walk and of life and beliefs. So I'm optimistic as well. I think that this can be a very, very positive, very, very optimistic outcome.
That's awesome. Well, this is a good place for us to wrap. Dritan, this was fascinating as always. Really glad to have you on the show, Alex. It was also a great discussion. And guys, please leave us comments, rate our show, tell us what topics interest you so we can make more shows about them. And yeah, until next time, have a great evening.
Thank you both.